Welcome once again to the Lion's Roar. This is Sifu David A Ross. I mentioned something in a previous podcast. May have even mentioned it several times about the fact that it's easy to forget that people don't all have the same experience and the same background, and that we don't have any sort of like standard shared history, particularly of martial arts in the United States, for example, for people to know things that came in the past, and especially like as you get toward my age, you have to remember that people didn't have the same experiences, and I think that's especially true as we left the age, sort of the golden age of traditional martial arts, and we entered the age of mixed martial arts. And so I want to talk about some of these things and perspectives, and then also get back to some of the stuff about practical training. So if you realize that when I first started training, for example, everybody wanted to have belt ranks. Everybody wanted to get a black belt. I don't think that's true so much anymore. People sort of don't think in traditional martial arts terms anymore. And when we joined the school, they gave us a uniform, and we were barefooted, and we, did what we were told. And again, there was that sort of mysticism, was the belief that if you just shut up and listen, you get that black belt. And sort of this idea, especially when we were kids. I mean, I was doing martial arts as a kid, typical thing, but still in martial arts schools. And I mean, maybe for kids in martial arts schools, they still kind of believe this. The idea that at some point, you'll get that black belt and then you'll learn to do all these things. I mean, I think about my Taekwondo and Hapkido teacher and the way I viewed him as a kid, thinking that he was this mystical human being that, had all these secrets and could do all these, like, incredible things, And I said before, I realized at one point that I'm actually older, and now I'm a lot older than he was when he was training me, but we thought of him as this old wise master, because again, we were like 12, 13, 14 years old. So this is very different, sort of how we just approach things and, didn't question things. And now I think everybody questions everything to the detriment almost sometimes of the martial arts, because like if you question everything, I mean, prime example, I've mentioned before on the internet, I put up clips of Dan Gable, and somebody was like, what does that guy know about wrestling? And you go like, oh my God, or Smith, who's known for the Smith single leg, and everybody's like, that guy's doing it wrong. And I put up some clips the other day of a snap down, and somebody's like, well, it would never work. Snap downs work all the time in wrestling. I mean, everybody's an expert. But again, when I first started training, I was doing Korean martial arts, and of course you wear a uniform and you have belts and you go through the thing, and didn't think anything of it at one point for a couple of different reasons. I ended up training some Japanese martial arts, and again, like you put a uniform, you put a belt on, and then I started doing Southern Chinese martial arts, and the quote-unquote uniform at that time was basically a white t-shirt and black pants. We used to get kung fu shoes, and what was interesting also is we get kung fu shoes that would, like, I don't know how these things were made. They had like no grip whatsoever, and a lot of times you'd slip and slide. And I always noticed that people were having trouble, like, even performing their basic kung fu because of their shoes, but we all had to wear the shoes, and of course a sash. And what's interesting, of course, I did Hapkido. So Hapkido is, I could do a whole podcast just on Hapkido and where it sort of sits in martial arts world, but essentially you could call it a Korean form of jiu-jitsu. And we did a lot of throws and joint locks in it. My teacher was a little different than especially the Hapkido stuff that's come out in the last 20 years or so. I bought a series of books that were directly from Korea and stuff, and it reminded me of exactly what my Hapkido teacher said, which is that, they'll say there's like 5,000 techniques, but again, if you have like what we call a butterfly lock, twisting the wrist, folding the wrist lock, whether you do it off of a grab, off of a punch, off of a shoulder grab, off of a lapel grab, it's still that one technique. But they take it in all the different ways. Grabbing across my wrist, grabbing my same wrist, grabbing my uniform, grabbing my shoulder, grabbing my neck, throwing a punch at me, coming at me with a knife. It's all the same technique. That was the way he viewed it. And he said that it was a limited certain amount of techniques. Whereas you look at some things, like I said, even things that were produced in the last 20 years or so, and it's just, more of the same. But we do a lot of this stuff. This was probably a good setup for me when I ended up doing Shui Jiao, It was a good setup for me when I was doing Chinese martial arts. One of the things that I always mentioned was that doing Korean martial arts, we did a lot of sparring. I should maybe talk about that for a few minutes. Give me 1 second to take a sip here. For whatever reason, Korean martial arts have always had sparring. In Japan, the karate was considered too deadly to spar until Masayama came along and sort of influenced it all. And of course, the dirty secret, so to speak, about Masayama is the fact that he was ethnically Korean and, brought along this aesthetic towards sparring. We used to spar, no equipment. I mean, we didn't even, I wore a cup every once in a while, I think. Never wore a mouthpiece. And only time we ever wore shin pads was that at some point they became sort of required for the competitions. But, and then there was the hogu, which was the chest protector, which is always sort of counter-instinctual. We're not wearing any equipment except a chest pad that then makes it hard for us to do the kicking. And that came later also, because originally in the classes we weren't really using that at all. I remember asking I told this famous story about, I joined as a very little kid. I think I was about 8 when I first started doing Taekwondo, somewhere between 6 and 8. And I have trouble remembering this stuff because remember, this was that period that I was still sick and, the hospitals, and they were just trying to rebuild my body. But first started doing martial arts, and, the first thing they teach you is just forward stance walking, and then the second thing they teach you is, low block, and they teach you to walk with a punch, then they teach you to walk with an inside chop. And the first time that we did sparring, I said, well, this is like a technique they taught us, let me use it, and I inside chop somebody on the neck, and like the entire room full of kids sparring, and every instructor, every assistant instructor, everything, just the world stopped. And it wasn't that time, but as I got older, and I started teaching in the Taekwondo school, and I got very close to my Taekwondo teacher, I remember asking him, well, why don't we do these things anymore? And he said, well, in Korea, they did a lot of hand techniques. They sparred with, back fists and straight punches and chops and ridge hands and a lot of these things. He says, but the decision was made. And, this is something I could probably do a whole podcast about, but there's a good book about it also, about how the Koreans viewed martial arts martial arts being exported to other countries as a business primarily to revive the economy of Korea. And they were very much under one control, which was the Kukiwon, and they made certain decisions whether they were good or bad. That's not what I'm talking about right now. And so the decision was made, whether it was, some people said, was it to reduce injuries? Some people said it was to make it more distinctly Korean as opposed to looking like karate. The dirty secret being probably that most Korean martial arts, striking martial arts, Taekwondo, whatever fell under the banner of Taekwondo, really was a form of karate, Shotokan primarily. They got rid of this. So a lot of sparring, and I think that affected my Chinese martial arts experience because I came in with a lot of sparring experience. Maybe not, boxing, punching to the faces, but I had them boxing as a PAO with the kids. And I knew instructors that said to me, oh, wow, you have like a lot of sparring experience. And in Chinese martial arts, it's not always true. And that was true even back then. So what I'm getting to is that, we did stuff and we did the uniform grabs to do the throws and stuff. And so when I did Shui Jiao later on, that was, useful. It was interesting, though, because that interim period, that first period of doing Chinese martial arts, I was doing more Hung Ga, and then when that was not available, I tried to do some Dragon and some Praying Mantis. And, like I said, these were all considered, practiced among Southern stylists, and so the uniform was all basically the same, that white shirt, sash, and, pants. And so then we weren't thinking about grabbing a uniform. So then we started doing Shui Jiao. And what was interesting was it was mid to late 1980s. It was actually hard to get the jackets. And so we were doing some jacket stuff, but sometimes we didn't have the jackets and people didn't have the jackets. There certainly was stuff that could be done without, especially in Chang's lineage of Shui Jiao, because, he had used it to train the police and he'd used it to train military. Did a lot of that stuff. It just... uniforms. I mean, it's like, nowadays Kung Fu people go, well, we don't have, uniforms aren't really about it, and we kind of, and I've done it myself in the past, and I still kind of every once in a while fall back into it, go like, well, you shouldn't be wearing a karate uniform and doing Chinese martial arts. And generally, that's sort of true, except let's not forget that Hong Yishang's, Teng Shou Do, which is, one of the best Chinese martial arts schools that ever existed to train a pile of very skilled fighters. He adopted those uniforms and they worked. And, there were other organizations that did that too, that said like, well, I don't care, I just need a uniform to work out in. Shuijiao has its own uniform. Some people say it's kind of like a judo uniform or judo, then the other argument is, well, no, judo got it from that, but I don't really care about that. What I'm talking about is the uniforms. And, I went from totally accepting them to, oh, we don't wear them, to I'm not really sure. And then, by the time we got to Shantai-san, we were working out in our t-shirts and shorts and, looked like a pickup football game in a park in Brooklyn. Learning stuff with him, especially as we were like on grass. I mean, I remember doing the Datong, the Ditong, the Daysat stuff, which is ground stuff, and doing a fall and landing on hard packed earth and having all the wind knocked out of me. And but I've said now, I think that in modern training, we need to reconsider the uniform again. And it's ironic too, right? Because MMA people go like, well, MMA people work out in shorts and stuff. Yeah, well, except Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu people that work out in their uniforms, and Sambo people that work out in their uniforms. And I think it's a balance. I think it's just like I said with sparring. Like, you shouldn't be just doing Sanda sparring. You shouldn't just be doing MMA sparring. You shouldn't just be doing Muay Thai sparring. You should be doing clinching. You should be doing wrestling. You should be, clinching being grappling for setting up strikes, or wrestling being, grappling to set up takedowns and throws. There should be times where you're doing MMA, which is to mix up all that grappling, mixing both the striking and the throwing. So there's be times you should wear a uniform, and there's times that you shouldn't be wearing a uniform. Just like there's times you wear gloves and times you don't wear gloves. And again, Kung Fu people have big issues with gloves. They think that, Kung Fu can't be done with gloves. I think it's nonsense, to be perfectly honest. But let's talk about it. For example, the reason I say you need gloves is that if you really want to hit somebody, you need to wear gloves. Without gloves, you're not going to hit. People claim all the time they spar full contact without gloves and hit people and do drills and everything. They don't. With gloves, I throw a hook at you and you're really blocking a real hook. And I don't have to break my hand either if I hit your elbow by accident. Now, some things, obviously, you want to be able to train without gloves. But, again, it's not an either or. You're doing both. If you just do without gloves, you're going to miss a significant element of the striking. If you always train with gloves, well, then you're going to maybe miss some of the hand stuff, which, maybe you'll never use in a Sanda match, for example, but you'll certainly use in self-defense. And again, I'm always sort of thinking more about a martial education, like being an educated martial artist, as opposed to just sort of learning how to, fight in a ring. It's, I've never been about just preparing somebody for a sport. I've always said that whatever you decide to jump into, and at times, I've put people in widely different venues, it is about developing them as a martial artist. Same thing with uniform. Sometimes, and I remember, there was a period of my time when I was, I was thinking about the training I had done without uniforms, and I was thinking about training for MMA, and I said, well, we don't even need uniforms. And a judo instructor that I know said, well, he was from Detroit, remember? So he said there's good times of the year when people are wearing jackets, and learning how to grab a jacket is good self-defense. And I agree with him, and it was an observation. I went, oh, wow, you should always be willing to grow, which includes also admitting when you're wrong, and also admitting that you changed views. So, for example, I'll say that I've said things in the past, and they weren't always correct, or I changed my view on them. I'm always updating something, and if you're not willing to do that, well, you're not growing. You're stagnant. What I found interesting about wearing my uniform was the observation in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu about whether you should do gi or no gi, and that's a big argument among them. And Danaher, which is a brilliant Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu instructor under Renzo Gracie, had a very excellent observation, which I actually included in one of my books recently. which is he said that, if you're wearing a uniform, people have more control over you because they have more grips to grab you. So your defense has to get better. When you're training your attacks and you don't have a uniform to grab, it's hard to throw somebody, it's hard to submit them. For example, chokes wise, with a uniform, there's a million chokes. Without them, there's probably like 2 or 3 chokes you can really do. Then your offense gets better. So again, like sometimes you should be wearing your shui gel jacket and, learning your throws and stuff and learning those grips again, because if somebody's wearing a jacket, use them. Sometimes you should be learning how to throw somebody without a jacket. Sometimes you should be just learning how to throw somebody with gloves on. People always used to say, like, well, you can't learn to throw somebody if you have gloves on. And I would always point to Kung Lee, who was, the face, the most recognizable face of Sancho Sanda at the time. He certainly threw plenty of people with gloves on, and of course, all you have to do now is look at all the Sanda matches. Everybody's wearing gloves, and people get thrown all over the place. You have to just learn how to adapt and, grow. And again, that's sort of what I'm talking about also. So, and I keep saying that we want to preserve Chinese martial arts. And so, we have to be flexible. And my argument would be, if you've read my history book, the idea of not being flexible is not a traditional Chinese martial arts concept. It's only like a modern development, and I'm not sure why, but Chinese martial arts have always been very fluid. It's always been adapting. It's always been mixing. It's always been matching. There's always people that were willing to learn other things and change the way they were training. There were people that were willing to put gloves on, or people willing to go and train judo, and people learning to learn Western wrestling or Western fencing or quarterstaff fighting. The second book, if it ever comes out, I have a lot of this stuff. The second history book that I've been working on, it's just sort of sitting in a corner here. There's tons of this stuff, learning all kinds of stuff and cross-training. And also how we sort of believe that, these are Chinese martial arts. And another thing I'll point out is that if you're thinking Chinese martial arts in the sense of Han ethnic Chinese, you're wrong, because so much of what we consider traditional Kung Fu comes from what the Chinese would consider non-Chinese nationals. They're members of Chinese society, but they're not the mainstream Han Chinese. They're Muslims, they're Tibetans, they're Manchurians, they're Mongolians. And so much of the martial arts that we do are influenced by these other 4 groups. And at the time they were open to it, but then of course politics and, political correctness and things kind of muddied those waters. And I initially say, because I don't want to turn people off, it's not what you do, it's how you do it. But then I always sort of have that caveat that I add in at the end, which is I have these 5 conditions that if you train everything with, you'll know that you're training correctly. And I sort of say, but if you train that way, you'll find out that some things work and some things don't work. And I always sort of think that you'll end up in the same place. Truth is truth. If you go looking for it and you find it, it's the same truth. And I would argue that, if you go back and look at Chinese martial arts, this is why I think that people always focus on the differences, but I focus on the sames, the similarities, the things that are the same. Just like I say, if you really want to study Chinese martial arts, if you don't at least look at some Xingyi, you're not going to understand it. If you don't look at some Shui Jiao, you're not going to understand it. If you don't look at some of the Muslim systems, you're not going to understand it. If you don't look at the long fist stuff, and some of that is Muslim systems, you're not going to understand it. You got to look at some of the Southern stuff too. Shorthand. Then you got to look at the Southern longhand stuff, which is some kind of quote unquote Buddhist system that came out of Western China, and it was probably called Buddhist or called Lama or called Habga, whatever it was, because it was done by people from Western China, the frontier, and those people were associated with Tibetan Buddhism, Machong Buddhism, and so they were not Chan sect, what we would call Zen Buddhist ethnic Han Chinese that came in. So we want to always look at again, what's the best way to train? The best way to train is to be open to different formats for sparring. different formats, different times. Sometimes you train with gloves, sometimes you don't train with gloves. Sometimes you train with a uniform, sometimes you don't train with a uniform. And keeping your eyes open. And again, the argument sort of is, what do you do with the stuff that's not Chinese martial arts? Are you incorporating it, or are you just looking at it to see how they train? I'm not really sure what the answer to that is, other than I did tons of it. I always feel it informed what I did. I can definitely say that there's stuff in Shui Jiao that obviously is in Sambo and is in Judo and is in Greco-Roman wrestling. But whether I'm doing something and it came through Greco-Roman or from Judo or from Sambo, I don't really care. That's probably one of the most important answers. So we should start thinking, again, how did we get here? A lot of people teaching now, and I'm looking at some of my friends on Facebook and stuff, and they're always posting these cool pictures to me. I don't know if you were 20-something years old, I don't know if you relate to them. We all came through traditional martial arts. And what's interesting is I know a whole bunch of people that all came through traditional martial arts, and we're all very focused on fighting, and are still very focused on fighting. That's what traditional was in those days. And we're willing to do belts, and we're willing to do tradition, and we're doing things that, again, I've talked about this before. When you're traditional, you do things that are done for fighting, and you do things because they're done for tradition. I think the difference now with the MMA fighters, the MMA craze, those people that are interested in that, they're only interested in stuff for fighting. And I think also that leads sort of a misperception. For example, the health. Well, if you want to be a fighter, you have to be in good health. So, for example, some MMA people get this because, you see MMA people doing Qigong and yoga and, even in the Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, the gymnastica natural, which is basically kind of a form of yoga. But a lot of people, they miss the forest for the trees. I think that I used to be a huge proponent of MMA. I'm not as big a fan now. I think, again, I would sort of steal the Buddhist idea of the middle path. Somewhere between traditional and modern is the sort of path you want to go down. Somewhere in between, tradition, but not like blind tradition, because some of the things we used to do in the name of tradition we don't need to do anymore. But by the same token, the MMA people have sort of become like the proverbial, meatheads, sort of the stereotype of, only interested in working out really hard and beating people up kind of thing. It's not fair to all of them, certainly. Some of the best MMA people, again, have traditional background and still respect and practice aspects of the traditional. But again, that's the similarity thing. I think people are always prone or predisposed to looking for the differences instead of looking for the similarities. So, I got on here to do a couple of these brief ideas. I don't think I talked that long, but maybe tomorrow I'll get on again with a longer talk. As always, thank you for tuning in and thank you for listening.